Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
This is surely one of those nights when we're sure the native spirits have sent out word that the community should stay home. And we didn't get the message. Or something is happening out in the world and we don't know what it is, but we're fine. It's quite fine. So I wanted to talk tonight, I wanted to talk about fear tonight. We've been talking about refinement in the past few weeks. We had a series of discussion about refinement, and so actually the practice around fear is refinement also. But it comes up perhaps because I was in the Bay Area last week, and I was on BART, and going between Oakland and San Francisco, and a man got on with his bicycle, and he was reading this book, and I was very taken with the title. I thought that I had seen this book someplace before. Maybe I picked it up in the bookstore, but I never read it. But anyway, I was so taken, I wanted to know who the author was, and I called. He was, just across from where I was sitting, and I said, "Who is the author of that book you're reading?" Well, he was so excited that somebody else thought that this book was so good. So he said, "Oh, look at it for a few moments." And so it's The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. And it's Bessel van der Kolk, MD. And it's essentially a book about, I haven't read it yet, but it's about traumatic memory and how the body stores the memory of trauma. And so he goes through that in the brain, as far as I can tell, just going through. This is stage one of reading a book, where you sort of go like this and you see what's in it. So still at stage one. But then toward the end of the book, he gives some suggestions about how to deal with this. Mostly it's about people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, but other kinds of people children particularly, who've been abused and are still dealing with that as adults. So it's a very promising book, and the fellow on the train was saying, "Yeah, my therapist has recommended it, and I'm reading it, and we're going through it, and it's so good, it's so good." So, and to look at this young man, he was, tall, robust, a little bit Germanic-looking, blonde hair, muscular with his wonderful cycle. And so you'd look at him and you wouldn't think, "Oh, this is somebody who's suffering from trauma." But apparently he indicated in the very brief exchange we had that this is what he was working on. So, So the question of fear, I only bring this up because I thought I would talk about fear tonight. Why? I don't know. I don't always pick the topics. They sort of come to me, and there they are. And of course, our country, keeps toying with the problem of war and so forth, and all of these things that are happening, and it raises a great deal of fear in people. And so I want to talk about fear, and I want to talk about a Buddhist response to fear. So, of course, there are, I'm no expert in all of this. I'm not a psychologist. Human being who sees people around us, and myself too, who has dealt with fear in life. And it's one of those things that is most difficult, and it is the number one most favorite topic in Buddhist lectures when people are, what do you want to talk about? Mostly it's fear. Mostly it's what we face throughout life. So if you have 10 big topics to talk about, fear will take about 4 or 5 of them. So we are certainly, our country is, or if you listen to the news at all, we are being pushed and played with about response to, a fearful response to how the world is going. And so it behooves us to examine ourselves and understand how that mechanism of fear works in us, how it resides in the body, and how we can work with it as Buddhist practitioners. Certainly, there are some good fears. If a tiger is going to leap at me or a bear is coming through the woods, I'm certainly going to respond appropriately with fear, and I'm going to take care of myself and make sure I get out of harm's way. Or if I'm crossing the street and I see a car careening, I'm going to jump out of the way, and I'm certainly going to be fearful about the possibility that I might be hit. These are appropriate fears, and so fear has an important mechanism for us to understand how to keep ourselves out of danger and to be able to respond appropriately to something that puts us in danger. There are also other kinds of fear. I'm thinking about in Zen. There are stories about when people go into Zen training, they go to a monastery for training. There's a tradition where you knock on the door and you stand outside and you say, "Let me in, I want to train here." And they ignore you for a few hours, or they leave you out in the rain overnight, something like that. There are lots of stories like that. Keep saying, "Let me in, I sincerely want to study here." So eventually the temple master comes out and says, "Well, so, what do you have in mind?" And you say, "I really want to study in here." And so he might say, "Do you have any fear about study?" If you answer no, "I have no fear, I am fearless, I have no fear about study," they will not take you in. You'll say, "Thank you, this is not the place for you, go someplace else." So that question of fear has to do more with sort of the closeness to respect and the strength of the teacher, and the idea that we should be afraid that we wouldn't complete study more than we would fear the study itself. I mean, I certainly had that in my training. I was really scared that I wouldn't be able to finish, that I wouldn't have the strength to be able to finish the training, to be able to receive my completion of monastic training. I mean, you get a certificate and you have to do a certain amount of study. And it's very, very difficult, and you really want to run away from it. And the only time in my life I actually made, like a prisoner, I made X's on a calendar. I drew up a calendar and made X's for every single day. And I was really frightened that I wouldn't be able to finish. And I really wanted to be able to do that. That's a good kind of fear. That kind of fear charges you with some kind of energy to keep going and to manage through. And I also remember a time when I was at a Zen conference, and I was sitting at a lunch table with a bunch of teachers, and somebody told me that my teacher, a first teacher that I had, Koben Roshi, had just come into the building. And I looked at them and I said, "Oh, I'm scared." And all together they said, "Oh, he must be a really good teacher." So the question of having just a little bit of, not exactly fear, but a little bit of really high respect around the teacher, not knowing what the teacher how the teacher might respond to us, is really necessary, I think, in our college training as well as in our Zen training, because the teacher cannot be effective if we don't have that kind of deep respect, which is not a deep fear. It's not what I mean at all, but it is a healthy high respect that says, I just don't know how. Maybe it's an apprehension more than a real fear. But in any case, there are many levels of fear that are important to us and that are useful and good. So mostly we're talking about those kinds of fears that impede our health, that are maybe founded in anxiety that come out of the imagination, perhaps, or are a result of a fear that we had that's carried forth. For instance, those of us, as I mentioned, our national state, I know there were 3 people in the room who were alive during World War II, and I know that one among us is a war veteran and who was deployed, and so we carry a kind of a trauma related to. I've been through 6 wars now in my lifetime, 6 wars in our country, and so there's an accumulation of image that comes out of this kind of difficulty. Also, knowing people who have been to wars, relatives who have been through wars, and the closeness that we come to it. So we carry a historic trauma, let me call it. It's not exactly a full trauma, but we carry that historic record that we know we are capable of coming so close to disaster. And so something charges up in us, and so we experience a kind of fear in relationship to that because of our memory, our historic experience through what our country has been through, or what other countries have been through also. So, so these kinds of fears are, particularly unhealthy fears, and other kinds of fear that we carry that may be more personal fear that may bring about some unhealthy sense for us. So certainly we have talked in the past about dealing with anger and noticing anger in the body, because anger is the best one to really feel what happens in the body when we feel angry. If we just work with the body for a moment, we notice the body gets heated, it gets hot, tense, upset. And a similar thing happens with fear, only it's a little slightly different in how it reacts in the body. But, maybe the heart goes faster, the heart rate goes faster, maybe we lose some ability to speak smoothly, or we just pull back and we're non-communicative. There may be all kinds of physical reactions about the body in relationship to fear. So practicing with the body is a really excellent way to understand when fear is operating in us. And it may come out of the unconscious too, which is operating so quickly and so unexpectedly that it's taken over us before we are even able to respond to it. But working with the body and noticing the body is one excellent way to deal with it, to look at it in any event. And certainly in our practice, one thing we do is we look at it. We look at whatever is going on in the mind or the body. We simply see it for what it is. So, question we can ask ourselves, if we are able, if we have the presence of mind, is to ask ourselves, what is being threatened when we have a sense of fear? What is being threatened that causes us to respond in this way? I mean, it could be a myriad things. I mean, there's so many things that we might experience around fear. And many of them may be not something physical, but something quite psychological, or something surrounding the ego. Maybe I'm worried about what somebody thinks of me, or maybe I'm worried about how I'm doing or performing and what I'm doing. I'm going to ring a bell in Zen, and people are going to hear it, and they're going to judge me accordingly for that. So there are just a myriad range of possibilities in this. But the question we ask, what is being threatened? And it just gives us a little space to be able to see what has cropped up in us that might be historically related, or might be a sense of storage of fear that we have from past experiences. But now I want to say what another kind of Buddhist response, aside from those that's certainly a psychological way to deal with it. Our self-image is here. Maybe somebody will think I'm stupid or something like that, which is easy for me to think. It's very possible, but I kind of enjoy it anymore. So on Saturday mornings we are studying the Heart Sutra. And right last week we talked about that we chanted tonight, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So we have the question of this body that we appear in, that we each have, that is completely unique. Nobody, like snowflakes, nobody has the same body that we have. I mean, some of the assembly is, similar. Fortunately for the medical community, in case we need help with the interior or for surgery, fortunately, the appendix is where it is, and all those things, placements are pretty standard, but we're all different. Everybody is entirely unique. Every body is unique. And so we have this question of form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And to really try to understand that the body itself is emptiness. The body itself is Buddha nature in its totality. And the mind itself is Buddha nature in its totality. This is very difficult for us to really, really accept, because we think of the body as being something concrete and something fixed. And then in our mind we have created a self that we have organized via an assembly of ideas about ourselves, and that we've actually made up a self that in Buddhism is not real. And the body is not substantive in Buddha teachings. This is the Buddha's teaching, that we are not substantive. Even physics will tell us that we are not substantive. We're just a bunch of floating stuff. So a Buddhist response then to the question of fear is to really understand Buddha nature and to rely upon Buddha nature as a response to fear. Rely upon what is our true self and our true reality as a response to fear. Most fears are unfounded. Most fears are unreal. Most are. Most are made up, and the self that we made up is the one holding on to those fears. Now, I don't suggest this is easy by any manner of means, but that is what we work with in Zen practice. We work with looking at the self that we created, a conditioned self, we might call it, the conditioning of our experiences that we accumulated, and understanding that the skandhas that we chanted tonight, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, color, sound, smell, taste, touch, object of mind, realm of eyes, are all emptiness itself, are all Buddha nature, simply Buddha nature. So we are called to work within this understanding that we are something more real than the pain and suffering that we experience. So in the chanting that we did tonight, this is how we overcome suffering. This is how we go beyond the suffering, or we decide ourselves that we have had enough of suffering. What did I write down here? The 3 precepts, 3 important precepts. So the 3 important precepts we practice is to refrain from all ill. That might be ill will, might be ill thinking, might be fear, which causes illness in us, just as anger does. So to refrain from all ill. And in that, refraining from all ill means we stop hurting ourselves. We stop hurting ourselves with our own made-up conditioning, with the ideas that we are holding on that are not real. And then the next precept is to cultivate all good. And in this, in cultivating all good, we address the wholesomeness that we are. And in the practice of the wholesomeness of each oneself, this is where our refinement comes, another practice of refinement, understanding the wholesomeness of the true body. And then we benefit all beings. And in benefit all beings by understanding that we are essentially pure light energy, we benefit all beings because we give light to the world around us. We give light to all beings. By being wholesome and understanding true wholesomeness within ourselves, and understanding that there's no need to continue to hurt ourselves by holding on to our suffering. And fear is suffering. And certainly in the study of this book, this is about letting go of that kind of old trauma that disables us from being really leading healthy lives, being really, really healthy, and being able to be what we truly are and want to be, and to embrace our talents, and to go forth and pick up those things that we yearn for. And that's what our practice is. To come to really understand what our suffering is, how we have made it up, how we are holding on to it, and how to release it. And that is Zen practice. No easy job, nothing easy about it. But for me, having come through deep suffering myself and come to Zazen because of suffering in my own life, I personally have not found a better way. I have not found another way at all. So this is where we are. And essentially there are 4, let's go back to the psychology for a moment. There are just 4 emotions and all emotions are encapsulated in these 4 emotions: anger, sadness, fear, and joy. And those are the 4 big emotions that all others are pretty much contained. So we have the psychological realm in which we can work, in which we can ask ourselves, what is being threatened on the psychological realm? We can do that and look at ourselves, just look, teach ourselves to be able to make a little space between the emotional reaction and our presence, our ability to be present. And then we can understand the realm of Buddha nature, our spiritual realm, in which we understand something that perhaps has a greater, at least for my understanding, has a greater ability to bring us to a full-blown, blossomed, wholesome strength. And so that is where I encourage us to rely upon Buddha nature for the step that we take. Naturally, we have to clear up our psychological body. Psychological body must come along with us, but the spiritual body is there to inform us that we can step beyond the psychological, and we can incorporate these together, the psychological body and the spiritual body, and bring them into one, into a full understanding of what we truly are, the wholesome and the, I always have to look at my notes, the wholesome and the past beyond suffering and the true light energy that we are. So maybe you have something that you would like to say or question or add or... Yes, Bob. And this is such a huge subject. Fear is an immense subject. I bring but a small part to it.
Yeah,
so.
I guess as I was listening to your talk, it occurred to me that, I mean, do we need to develop, I don't know how to say this, befriend suffering in some way, so that if I'm to examine my suffering, whatever it is, I have to be with it.
You must
I have
be
to
completely
experience
honest.
it. I have to experience it
Yeah.
in such a way that I can. Gosh, I want to. The other word that came up was discriminate. Is this is this suffering legitimate? Is it something I'm making up? Is it something existential? Is it, what is it?
Yeah, right.
But in order to do that, I have to suffer. I have to be with it.
Look at it.
I have to look at it, right. And so there's this fight or flight thing that goes on.
Yes.
That I have to get past before I can just settle into it.
Well, this is fear, of course, in operation in the flight issue, in which we don't want to look at it. We don't want to admit it. We don't want to go through the turmoil of it, or even for some of us, the terror around that, whatever it is we have created, whatever the fear is. But it has to be done. And it's the ability to look at it, when it's way up here, high anxiety, way up here, and then let's say that down here is, no anxiety down here. The minute that we say, okay, I'm going to look at it, the very minute that we do that, this line immediately begins to descend on the anxiety line. It immediately does. And so that's a very hard one to come to understand that we lower our anxiety by looking at the issue straight on.
Yeah, I sometimes feeling it doesn't mean I'm going to die. In other words, I mean in an extreme way.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I can survive this. Yeah. This is just what's happening right now.
Right.
And
that's correct. Yeah. Okay. And we do all carry the existential business that we're going to die, and the existential issue of what is the meaning of life and how do I live? And so we have all of those things that continue, but we have to be able to look at those straight on in a beneficial way. So, and that means lowering the anxiety level so that we can do that, so that we can be clear and we can find meaning in our lives and deal with the existential issues that aren't going to go away. So,
thank you.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you. It's. So I'm also. I was teaching writing. I'm a writing teacher at South Puget Sound Community College for many years, and the students, would wait until the day before turn in their essays, right? Utter fear sitting in their minds because they were terrified to address this blank piece of paper that they had to turn in the next day. And so I would always do that, draw a straight line on the blackboard, straight up line, say, okay, that's the line of anxiety. And I'd say, down here is your lifeline. And then take that line and say, but here is the lifeline, and you're going to get down here to where you're going to turn in your paper. And the second you start to write that paper, that anxiety line is just going to go, woo, just like that. So it was fake, of course. It wasn't a true thing, but they just thought it was great. Got through every time. But it is true about anxiety like that. It is that same sort of thing that once we just even tiptoe into it and just admit and come toward some bit of honesty, and the other side to this is we're going to suffer until you don't want to suffer anymore. A lot of people enjoy suffering, and this is one of the problems, is that suffering has become habitual. And so they will continue to suffer as long as they want to suffer. And shikattaganai, as we say in Japanese, can't be helped. Have to decide, I don't want to suffer anymore. And once you come to that, that line will come down fast. Once we decide. I recall on the cushion, I came with great suffering to Zen practice, and I recall on the cushion the moment I decided I didn't want to suffer anymore. And then, of course, it's not over. There's work to be done, to be faced. But then then we have the promise of joy as it comes forward, and the emotions of, opening the heart to happiness and compassion and doing what we want to do with our lives. So all of these things open to us then when we say, I don't want to suffer anymore. It doesn't mean that we aren't with suffering in the world, or that we don't see suffering and that we don't suffer ourselves because of that. But it is no longer the personal development of suffering within ourselves. It's a different suffering. It's a recognition and a compassion around the suffering that is created via the human condition. But personal suffering diminishes. That is what is so worthwhile. So we have a clear field to really bring our lives into fruition and let our lives flourish. Be loving partners to people and whatever our life situation is. So, yeah? Anybody else? Anything? Yes.
Question is wondering.
Yes.
You say clear our psychological bodies and then merge our spiritual and psychological bodies. You think the psychological clearing comes from Zazen? Is it primarily looking?
No, I think so, but I don't think only from Zazen. I mean, one of the problems we have around the Eastern traditions is that we can head into the ecstatic state or into high spiritual experiences and forget that we have to clean up our psychological self. So I like Ken Wilber's teaching. I don't know if you know him, but he has these 3 areas where you grow up, you wake up, and you clean up. So in some sense, in the bringing our psychological, cleaning up our psychological body, we're also growing up in that. And that work has to be done because we know certainly there are people who've had profound enlightenment experiences and then been done really stupid stuff. So we have to mature in all of these areas of life, not just... And I'm not positive myself that Zazen alone does that. We have to look at our other... We have to clean up our act wherever we go and act appropriately in the rest of the world and bring ourselves to maturity. in all of those areas. So, but I think that Zazen allows us the presence to see where it is that we have to grow up, or what it is we have to clean up. But Zazen won't do that for us. But it allows us to have the vision and the ability to see honestly and clearly where that is. Yeah.
What is the process to clean up, or is that vary from person to
That
person?
is, I'm 77. Takes a long time. Cleaning up and growing up and waking up are all your whole life. I think, anyway. I mean, just as soon as you think, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I admit that happened, and I'll fix that. Something else comes up. Life is one long homework. I mean, truly, I think if we're honest, that's what it is. And if it weren't, we'd get somewhere and we would stop working on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a joyful thing to look at the shadow side. I mean, you need your shadow side to be creative. Mm-hmm. So it's not like you're going to become all good and you're going to be so wonderful in anything. You're always going to look at the shadow for the rest of your life. But the shadow is really important for creative work. And I think for continual growth and for keeping us human and compassionate.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the other older people, you would agree. Maybe you plateau a little bit for a week or something. Then you see something else, you got more work. Or something, you do something stupid, and then you realize, yeah. So, it's all good. It's all good. It's all teaching. So, all right, everybody good? Okay.